So, welcome everybody to Project Codex. My name's Lee Warwick. I'm the organizer of this little shindig meetup. I also do a podcast, all that good stuff. Google Lee Warwick or whatever, and Tech Junior, you can see that. But today we've got an awesome event. We are talking with Jason Byrne. So I'm going to hand it off to him in a second, but Jason, if you want to introduce yourself and do that and go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thank you, Lee. I'm going to share my screen here. I've got a presentation that we'll do with this. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So probably something you don't hear right now because I don't know if it's going to come through the audio. I'm going to try to play some Lady Gaga, which is our theme for today. If you didn't pick up the living on the edge, or not actually the living on the edge. Living on the edge is too cliche. I decided not to do living on the edge. I decided to do On the Edge of Glory by Lady Gaga. So today we're going to be talking about edge computing. And before I do that, just to tell you who I am, my name is Jason Byrne. I'm the vice president of engineering at Flosports. Some of you know the company. We're a sports streaming company. So right now, Lee and I were just talking. There's not a lot of sports going on because of COVID-19, but that's starting to change. And so we're really looking forward to sports turning back on so we have something to stream again. But we've been streaming a lot of oldies but goodies, replays, and live shows and things like that in the meantime. I'm also the founder of MileSplit, which was a startup that I started in college in the track and field space, really popular, big website that I sold to Flosports about 8 years ago. So I've been with Flow for the past 8 years. I will go show this at the end, but if you do want to get in contact with me, here's some of the best ways. Hit me up on ODevs. You can see my personal website, my LinkedIn, or my Twitter. I would love to hear from anybody on the call. But without further ado, I want to talk about edge scripting. But before we talk about edge side scripting and really explain to you what that is, because a lot of people out there don't yet know what it is, haven't ever heard of it perhaps, I want to give some background on some other things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be a little bit of a fortune teller. I'm going to tell you if you're just starting a new application and your application ends up taking off, what your future is going to be like, because that sets up why you need a CDN to begin with. And some of this may be outdated if you skip ahead and you don't go the old model, which the old model was just setting up servers. So maybe you know what serverless is and you can skip some of this initial pain. But if not, you're going to go through this life cycle. You're going to stand up your application on a single server. It's going to get popular. Your server is going to start getting hot, and you're going to have to figure out what to do with it next. The next thing you're going to do is say, hey, it doesn't make sense to have my application and my database on the same server, so you're going to split off a database server. You're going to get more popular. You're going to stand up more application servers. You're going to stand up a load balancer in front of it. It's going to continue to grow. You're going to get caching layers. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. And at some point, you're going to decide to separate out your static storage, your images, your JavaScript, your CSS into a storage bucket so that way it doesn't hit your server. And then you're going to end up putting a CDN in front of it. That's a lot of people's first exposure to CDNs, and I know it was mine. So one of the popular things to do is you would have the CSS, JavaScript, and images in an S3 bucket on Amazon, and you'd put CloudFront in front of it. And so probably a lot of you have heard of CloudFront. CloudFront is a CDN. And so we'll talk in a minute more about the details of the CDN. But one of the things that people miss is that CDNs aren't just for static content. You can put dynamic content in front of the CDN. And we're going to talk about how to do that, because again, most people think that you can't because it's got to change for every user. But through some stuff we're going to talk about later today, you can unlock that magic next level. So let me just skip ahead. So what is a CDN exactly? Whether you realize it enough, one congressman once said that the internet is a series of tubes. So what he meant by that in some crazy way is that when you make a request to a server, a lot of people think of it that it's going to be just this direct request that goes from your user directly to your server, but that's not the case. the request from the user actually meanders through dozens, literally, of servers and routers and networks and ISPs and backbone providers until it finally arrives at your server. So it's not a straight path by any means. It's not an efficient path by any means. So every single hop in that chain is going to introduce latency, and it's going to slow down your request. So what we achieve when we put a CDN in the mix is we cut out most of all those hops, and your content gets cached with the CDN, and then there's only, maybe 4 hops between your user and the content, and not 12 or 15. So how does that work exactly? A CDN at its core is a distributed network of servers. So if you sign up with a CDN company, they have a POP, a point of presence, or an edge location all over the world. So they might have one in Miami, they might have another one in Tampa, another one in Atlanta. So whenever that request comes from a user, it's going to go to an edge POP that is physically close to them. And physically close to them typically also means network topographically close to them. So again, that's how you can say there's going to be 3 or 4 hops versus 12 or 15. And the more of those hops you can pull out in between, as you'd imagine, the faster that response to your user is going to be, and the happier your user is going to end up being. In this world, we call the your server, where the actual content lives, is the origin. I have to keep moving the Zoom window around. That's called the origin. And again, the edge pops are those geographically close locations to the user. The CDN takes care of caching your content and distributing it to its edge pops. I'm happy to dive in more into details, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds here. So this is to point out that your origin may be your server, but it also may be a bucket, like an S3 bucket. It doesn't really matter what it is. The origin is basically where the original content originates, right? So that's the origin. So what are some of the benefits of having a CDN in your pipeline? One, it keeps the load off your server. This cannot be understated, because again, as you start to scale, every single request that's going to come back to your server is more demands and more cost and more everything, and slower response to your user. Your CPU starts spiking, and now you got 500 errors, or it just slows down. So the more heat you can keep off your server, the better. So that's the first and foremost. But what the CDN does is cache your content close to the user, so the user also gets the benefit of, maybe instead of a 500 millisecond response, maybe they get the content back in 50 milliseconds, which is a huge difference from the user perspective. Low latency. Other benefit is you don't have to maintain it. You can maintain some of your own cache servers, and you could, in theory, have your own POPs if you wanted to. But that is more stuff for you to have to maintain. Like, you can maintain your Redis servers, your Varnish servers, or whatever caching on your own. But I don't want to have to maintain more servers than I have to. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead, but there's some other benefits there. Here's some popular options. You've probably heard of a lot of these. The ones on the far left are the established players. Akamai, Limelight, and Edgecast have been around since about 2000, some of them, 2000 to 2007 kind of range at least. So they're the established players, but in my experience, they're also the ones that are lagging behind technology-wise. The ones in the middle are the ones that I'm excited about. They're some of the kind of movers in the space: Fastly, Cloudflare, and StackPath. StackPath actually has an office locally. Some of you probably know them. And they acquired Max CDN and Highwind. So they're great, and they have an office in Winter Park, and they're good people to work with. And also Amazon CloudFront, I mentioned before, that's a popular CDN that a lot of you maybe have actually used. Google CDN is coming out, it's kind of in a slow release, but they're going to be here soon, and they're probably going to be a major player in the near future. And Key CDN is not one that I've used, but I've seen mentioned a number of places, so I included them. Next thing is the other component of Edge scripting is it's serverless. So what is serverless? And I'm going to kind of speed through this because I hope a lot of you already know this. Rather than maintaining your code on a server that you have to scale up and down, either by like auto scaling means or by just paying for extra servers you don't need, if you deploy your code into a serverless platform, like AWS Lambdas is the most popular, you no longer have to worry about the server. You don't have to update the server. You don't have to worry about scaling the server. And maybe the best part is if you do no load, you're literally paying for nothing. So at 3 a.m., if you're renting a server at 3 a.m., you at least have to have one server running. Just by the off chance that somebody comes to your site, you've still got to pay for it. But with serverless, it handles that scaling up and scaling down all the way to 0 for you, and scaling up, to a very high number for you as well. So it takes a lot of that frustration off your plate. I don't want to do a deep dive into what serverless is here, but it's really has been a revolutionary new concept that has gotten popular in the past 3 or 4 years, and definitely would encourage you to become an expert in that. So some of the key benefits that I mentioned of serverless is it saves you money, it scales up and it scales down. You don't have to maintain it, and deploying it is super easy and fast. Like you don't have to worry about configuring any server and how you're going to set up the CI/CD pipeline. Usually it's just a simple command line that you might type. Serverless, SLS publisher. With Cloudflare workers we'll talk about later, theirs is called Wrangler, so it's like Wrangler publish. Firebase, maybe some of you guys use that same way. You just run a simple command and it goes up there and kind of does the magic for you. You don't have to worry about it. Some of the popular options in the serverless world is AWS Lambda. Google has a product called Cloud Functions, and also Firebase Functions, which is essentially the same thing, different name. And Azure, which I do not use, but in the Microsoft Cloud, they also have Azure Functions. Each of those services, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft also have a different serverless version that runs containers. So that's like Fargate, Cloud Run, and container instances that are similar concepts, but with Docker containers instead. Okay, so now we talked about CDNs. We talked about we've talked about serverless. So let's get into the real meat here. Both of those build upon each other to form the edge scripting or running scripts at edge. So what does this mean? So we talked earlier about a CDN, and our users have less hops because they go and they pull that static content from the CDN, the CDN is already cached. And that works great for static content for your images and your CSS and your JavaScript. But for dynamic content, that's a challenge because, if I serve something that says, welcome Lee Warwick, at the top, and says log out, log in at the top, that's not going to work if all of a sudden they serve that cache content to me, right? So normally you can't do that with a CDN, but when you can run edge-side scripting, you can also run code on the CDN POP at that edge of the internet, the POP locations, point of presence. So now all of a sudden you can do all this dynamic stuff that usually you could only do on your backend server. You can do that at the CDN Edge, which is super exciting. And if you don't see it yet, hopefully you'll, by the end of this presentation, you'll understand why that's so powerful and so cool. So what does this all mean? Hopefully you guys catch this meme if you're old like me and remember this meme from 2010. But what this means is that we get all the benefits of serverless. We get all the benefits of the CDN. We couple that with low latency, fast execution, smart custom proxy layer that we can put in front of that cache. We can separate out some of our logic that we don't have to put on our backend servers anymore. And so let's talk about some use cases. So this is how the cloud in the middle represents the CDN. All of that is stuff running at the CDN. So every CDN is going to have automatically built in for you a firewall. So that means, especially Cloudflare is really great about this. So they have like denial of service protection. They have some of these things in front of you that you don't even have to worry about, that gives you protection out of the box. After the user request passes through the firewall, it gets to your Edge script. And then after it goes from your Edge script, it goes to CDN's cache. And in this diagram, I'm saying it's a cache hit. What a cache hit means is a user requested a certain file, and that file was already in cache. So we never have to go back to your backend server. Your server doesn't ever have to have any of that load. The CDN already has it, gives it back, and then your Edge script can also process the response coming out of cache, so you can manipulate that response before you give it back to the user, and then finally the user gets that response. If we had a cache miss, which means the user requested a file and we went to the CDN cache and the CDN did not have a copy of it, all that means is the CDN would go back to your origin server, pull a copy of that file, cache it, and then return it to the user the same way. And so then the next user that came back, now they'd have a copy of it. So that's the cache hit and a cache miss. But either way, your Edge side script, which we're going to again dive into in a second, gets to handle the front end of that request and manipulate the request or interpret the request. And they also get to manipulate the response before it goes back to the user. Does that make sense, Lee? So here's some of the popular providers of Edge scripting. Lambda Edge is a version of Lambda that can run in CloudFront with Amazon. The two in the middle are the ones I'm most familiar with, and I'm really excited about: Cloudflare Workers and StackPath Edge Engine. And the one on the right is one I literally just got access to a couple weeks ago because it's in a closed beta, but I've been working with Fastly to help us start to play around with that, and they're going to have a product out soon. These are the four players that are really pushing the industry in the Edge scripting world. Your Akamai, your Limelight, your Edgecast, all those old dinosaurs haven't come out with a product yet. Even Google doesn't yet have one, although I've been talking to the Google product team with their Google CDN, and they are going to have one, but it might be another year and a half probably. So this is the way the world's going, but these are the kind of the players you want to take a look at. So here is some of the use cases. What I don't recommend is trying to run your whole application at the edge, although you could. But here's some of the things that are really cool that you can do. So let's say you have a legacy application, some old API that's written in some really slow script that nobody likes to maintain, and then you're slowly replacing that API with a new API. Probably a lot of you have been in that boat before. The best way, in my opinion, to do those kind of things is a slow iterative migration from the old to the new. But that gets really challenging because every time you move your one endpoint from the old to the new, now you've got to update all the clients to know which one to look at. But what you can do is you can have this at-edge scripting as a proxy for your API. And so all the requests can still come into the same endpoint, the same domain, the same everything. And you can put the intelligence at that edge side proxy running in this the Cloudflare worker or whatever that knows, oh, well, if you're requesting get articles, that's still on the old API, but we've moved over the get videos. So we're going to route that to the new API backend. So that allows you a really graceful way to migrate, and your client doesn't know the difference. So it's really cool. Another potential thing you can do is you can run all your authentication at the edge. So maybe it's an API again, like I have in this example. In our use case at Flosports, we have content that is only available to our subscribers. So we have like video content that's locked away in an S3 bucket, and we don't want you accessing that content unless you paid for it. So what we've been able to do, we actually did this with StackPath Edge Engine, was we did the validation at the Edge server so that Edge script stands in front of our content. And when the user comes and requests it, we say if they don't have a valid token. They don't have a valid JWT token. We're like, get out of here, 403. You can't see the content. And if they do have a valid token, then we allow them to go to our backend and we allow them to get the content. So, you could do that, like I said, with videos, but you could also do that with your API. Maybe you don't want to have to worry about doing all the authentication on your API within your API code because it just complicates your API code base. Or you can have your API not worry about authentication at all, and you could have this the Edge script be your proxy sitting in front of it, and it handles all the auth, and nothing will make it to your API unless it's already validated. So that's a great way to separate out that logic and maybe have some cool abstraction. And the side benefit, again, is it's load that never hits your server for invalid users, and it's also faster for the user to get that response. Trying to zoom through. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask you real quick, like what if you've been able to measure like the performance gain of moving like authentication from API to the CDN Edge?
Performance gain or bandwidth gain?
I guess more of like in sense of speed, but then I guess you could also talk about like usage as far as like how intensive it is for the API to handle like all the requests versus only the authenticated requests.
I think it depends on your application, obviously, and how efficient your code is, and and that the authentication is one thing, but also think about it from the perspective of you can cache a lot of these GET responses, right? So even for authenticated users, if you have a bunch of people requesting that, get articles or get videos endpoint or whatever, and that gets requested a lot, why do those need to ever make it to your server? So you could cache those GET responses in the CDN. And so it is a 200, but it immediately returns with the payload. That's perhaps even a bigger gain, right? Because now not only is those are a ton of responses that your server doesn't have to handle, doesn't have to go back to your database, perhaps to query it again, but it also again is 10 hops closer to your user. So the actual performance gain again is going to be dependent on how optimized your application is. But I'll put it this way: we often have cache hit ratios. They better be north of 80%, and we want them north of 95%. So what that means is if I have a 95% cache hit ratio, that means only 5% of my requests are actually making it to my backend server. If I have an 80% hit ratio, that means 20% of my requests are making it to my backend server. That's really the kind of percentage you're aiming for. So by extension, again, you can take that much load, 80% of the load, 90% of the load off of your backend. Pretty significant, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Is that anything else on that, Lee?
No, I think you covered it. Cool.
Some other things to give you. We talked earlier about like, hey, you can't cache content that's going to be static. It's still a challenge. I'm not going to lie, but there is, because you're running code in front of the cache, you can actually personalize that content. So let's, for example, say that the response that you get, your origin returns maybe has some template code in there that says, user, bracket, user account info, bracket, end bracket, whatever, right? And then so you can cache that kind of templated content. And because your Edge side script knows the authentication status, because they can read your cookies, see if you have a JWT token or whatever method you used for authentication, they know who you are. They know if you're logged in, logged out. They know if you're Lee or if you're Jason. And so you can do, right before you send that response back to the user, you can modify that response to have that personalized content. That's just one example. Obviously, you can do, not just with the user account information, but other content as well. Another thing, I don't know how many of you do A/B testing, but in A/B testing is like, we don't know if this new change to our website's good or bad. So what are we going to do? We're going to test it first. We're going to give some users the control, the original way that it looked or the thing that it did, and we're going to give some users something different. Let's say it's a blue button and a green button. And our theory is the green button is going to compel people to click on it more than the blue button. But we want to actually measure that. So what we can do is we can have the edge side script decide, like, I'm going to put 50% of the users showing them a blue button, 50% of the users I'm going to show them a green button. And then by some means on the client side, we're going to measure, how many more click on it, right? So we can bucket our users into an A or a B treatment, and the edge side script can handle that. That can be potentially a completely separate HTML file, by the way. Like, so let's say you have your index.html, if we're just doing completely static, and you can throw up an index2.html that is a completely different layout, and you can, route half of them one way and half of them to the other, and see what the performance is like, or how they like it. Similarly, let's say you're rolling out a beta site and you don't want to give 100% of your users this beta site, but you want to kind of do a slow release. You can have it route 10% of your users to the beta. Just keep rolling through some different ideas, just hopefully get your imagination going. I get really excited about this because your imagination is really the limit with this stuff. You can do so much. Let's say your client is making multiple API requests. We're making a request to our primary API. We're making a request to third party. We're making another API request. Well, you could have your client make one request that gets interpreted at the edge. Your edge can fire off 2 simultaneous async requests, and then you can respond to your user. And maybe that request is already cached, right? So super fast. And then you can respond to your user with one request that it was actually 2 or 3 or more on the back end. Similarly, that was with a third-party app. Maybe you have a videos endpoint and an articles endpoint in your API, but you just want to let the client request all content, right? So you could still keep them as separate endpoints in your backend API. You could run those asynchronous requests, and then you could send the user back a merge response. I want to skip. I thought I had another use case here related to that. But so I'll just tell you, like, same thing with, like, let's think about GraphQL. Maybe you have backends. You guys maybe know GraphQL and are really excited about that. But maybe, it's a pain to update your old backend APIs to support GraphQL, where you could leave those as REST, JSON responses, and you could have your Edge script, be the GraphQL interpreter that makes JSON requests, on the back end, and then turns them into, handles and returns GraphQL format to the user. I'm throwing a lot at you, but it's just, again, so much you can do. You could have your script handle, short links and do a redirect. They come in on this URL, and then we redirect them to the actual URL. We could block certain users who identify spammers by, maybe it's their user ID from their JWT token, maybe it's by IP address. We can block them and give them either a different response or a 403. We can potentially block China, because I don't know about you, but I've had China just spam my site nonstop sometimes. If you wanted to, you could completely block a country. One of the nice things about CDNs, and all of them do this, is the request headers that you will get on your script already have GeoIP information. So you don't have to go out to a third-party GeoIP service. They will already have headers that say what country, what city, what zip code, whatever. And so you can write at the Edge script right in line without doing anything else, treat different geographies differently. We do this all the time, actually, because we have, with our video streams, sometimes we only have the rights to certain geographies. So maybe we only have US rights. Sometimes we only have, like, Los Angeles rights. And so we can handle at the edge doing that geo blocking. We know that you're coming from LA and you're not allowed to watch this content. We can, return your response rather than the content. The at-edge scripts also can do more work after the response to the user. So again, the ideal situations, we're responding to the user as quickly as possible. So they get the request. We want to turn around a response to the user, if we can, within 30 milliseconds, right? But sometimes we want to do additional logging. Well, the cool thing about this at-edge scripting is we can return that response to the user, and we can do the logging to Datadog or to wherever afterwards. Similarly, if we had a gaming server and we, again, wanted gaming servers very sensitive to latency and fast responses, we could give the user a response back quickly after we validate that, the move that they made was allowed or whatever. We can give them a 200 response back before we actually commit it to the gaming server on the back end so that all the other people in the game will see it. So those are some ideas that you can use it. Here's some not good ideas. You can't use these AdEd scripts for anything that's really long-lived or processor intensive. You're not going to be processing any videos with this. Although you can process images, a lot of these are fast enough to do. I didn't have that in the slides, but you could do dynamic image resizer pretty easily at these AdEd scripting, which would be pretty awesome too. But nothing too long-lived. You can't do keep sockets open. All these, think about fast turnaround is the key to any of these edge side scripting. I'm going to pause there. I have some code that I can show you actually just doing some simple AdEd scripts, but let me pause for any questions from Lee or anybody in the audience before I show the code.
So we had a couple questions. One of them was asking about managing DB connections. I know that was way back in the slides, but are you able to elaborate on that at all?
Managing database connections from the Edge scripts?
I believe so. It wasn't really any more specific than that.
So technically speaking, you can do anything that you can do from a regular application in these AdEd scripts, pretty much. There are some hard cutoffs in some of those products like Cloudflare of how much processing time you can keep. So that's why, I mentioned on this slide, I don't think you should do anything that has long-lived processes. Technically, you could deploy your, full applications to these things, but I don't think that's their best use case. So that's my long way of saying that I typically would not connect directly to the backend database from the AdEd scripting, although you could. I would typically use it more of, I have my API that is my actual backend that talks to my actual database, and I have these AdEd scripts in front of that layer. But you could talk directly to your database. What you could not count on is any kind of, maybe this is the question, any connection pooling or keep a database connection alive so I can reuse it over and over again.
Yeah,
you should really think about every single request as a one-off request that's going to die as soon as it responds.
Yeah, the question is about opening lots of database connections. So I think it was if you have a big surge in traffic and that CDN spools up a bunch of different connections, I guess that would be kind of a poor use case if that's bad to connect to the database from that point.
Yeah, I wouldn't connect directly to the database from it. I would have the backend. One thing that maybe partially also answers this question is with any of these CDNs, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but you can configure what they call an origin shield. And so what does that mean? That means, let's say I have thousands of users, and some of them are coming from New York, and some are coming from Florida, and some are coming from Europe. They're all going to get to their local POPs, their local points of presence in their geography. What we don't want is the Miami POP and the Tampa POP and the Atlanta POP and the New York POP all going back to my server. Because if we have a flood of users and all this, that maybe helps us some, but we're still having more hits to our server than we want. So you can configure these CDNs to set up an origin shield for you. Sometimes you have to ask them to do it, but they'll do it. And what that would mean is if I go to the Tampa POP, the origin shield is set up as Oregon. So before Cloudflare would ask my actual origin for the content, if they request to go to the Tampa POP, say, hey, Tampa, do you have it in cache? The answer is no. Next thing they're going to do is they're going to ask the Oregon Cloudflare CDN POP, do you have it? And if the Oregon POP has it, Oregon will give it to Tampa, Tampa will cache it, and then give it to the user. So it still doesn't make it back to your user. And if you have a big flood at once, they have the intelligence to only let one of those requests go through to your backend server, and the rest of them will be, wait and then be cached. So it really helps, again, keep the load off of your server. I don't know. I still don't know if I answered the question completely, but
I think you covered it. In line with POP, somebody asked if serverless services would provide the closer POP. So I don't know if that's like a question of, is it better to put something on a CDN versus like Lambda or something as far as being close to the user. But I would have to imagine it's the CDN.
The CDN is going to be much closer. So first of all, I don't know if this is still the case, to be honest with you, but I think it actually, I know it is. Never mind. When you deploy like regular Lambdas, you are deploying that Lambda to a certain AWS region, and you have to do a lot of extra work if you want to make that multi-region, right? So you're deploying that Lambda to the Oregon AWS region in a certain availability zone. You're deploying it to Virginia. So all those requests through regular Lambda have to go all the way back to that same origin. So while you might, in that case, keep something off your server, it's still not as close to the user. And even if you use AWS, I'm not a big fan of AWS Lambda at Edge. Even if you use it, if you think about how many regions Amazon has, they don't have that many, right? They have Oregon, they've got, I think, one in Ohio and one in Virginia. That's not a lot compared to something like Fastly that has, I think, 100 POPs in the United States. Like, four locations versus 100. I mean, I'm going to take the 100. It's going to be, by definition, much closer to the user.
POP is point of
presence.
Okay. The other question that popped up was, puns.
Popped up.
Is a CDN cheaper to do the work than the actual server itself?
Good question. I find that it is, because keeping processing power around on servers, and a lot of times, you're paying for idle capacity, right? If you probably watch your CPU capacity on your servers, they probably sit at 5% a lot of the time, which means, just by the off chance you get a surge in users, you're paying for all this extra capacity, and you have to, right? And you have to, and not to mention the complexity of scaling up and scaling it down. The CDNs, much like, Lambdas, much like, any serverless thing, you're paying for what you use. So typically with the CDN, you pay for the bandwidth that you push, the actual, gigabytes that you push through it. You're going to pay some fee for that. And then with these ad-edge stuff, typically you pay by the request. And so I think Cloudflare workers, it's a minimum of $5 a month or something like that. And with that $5 a month, you get like either 5 or 10 million requests, which is probably more than anybody needs. And then beyond that, I think it's like 50 cents per million requests, right? So very, very economical.
Is there a like a cold start time with like a CDN worker or AWS Lambda at Edge or anything like that?
They are 100 times better than the Lambda cold starts. Oh yeah. The last thing that a CDN wants to do, a CDN makes their money by caching and returning responses to the user as quickly as possible. Like, they don't want to spend much time processing anything. So there's no, like with a Lambda, sometimes you can have 800 milliseconds to even up to 2 seconds sometimes of cold starts if it hasn't been hit for a while. I've noticed I've never had any delay. I want to say less than 10 milliseconds. Like, it's,
wow.
There's effectively no cold start with CDNs.
So if a serverless function, on a regular AWS Lambda runs basically the same and does the same thing as like Lambda at Edge or a CDN worker, when does it make sense to use like regular old serverless functions versus something on a CDN?
So we'd use Lambda for things that respond to other events in our architecture. Like, for example, we upload a video to S3. We would then fire off an SNS notification. I don't know if I'm getting too far in the weeds here. So it fires off a notification, which in turn fires a Lambda. It says, hey, we got a new video on S3, queue up an encoding job. that's not part of what would happen in a normal request, right? So that's still a great use case for Lambda to run those kind of jobs. Maybe it's a scheduled task. You can do scheduled jobs in Lambdas. Or maybe you have your API still running in Lambdas for whatever reason you think that's better, but you still can put these Edge scripts in front of it. So there's still definitely some use cases for Lambdas, and you still need a backend somewhere. I'm not advocating for you to run your whole application in these Edge scripting. I'm recommending that it sits in front of your application as a proxy. So again, you could have your backend still deployed to that regular serverless framework that you're comfortable with.
Okay. The last question that popped up was about
Lambdas can share database connections, by the way. Like there's ways to, once you can leave that connection open, and Lambdas are reused. These serverless at Edge stuff aren't reused. So anyway,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the last thing was about CDNs and how they handle cache. The question says cache slam, but I guess if you have a lot of traffic that's asking for cached assets, I assume the CDN handles that automatically.
Yeah, I mean, that's what a CDN does. That's what they're built for. They're built to handle load. They have way more redundant network bandwidth. I mean, typically what CDNs do doesn't actually take a lot of processor, so they don't need a lot of processing power, but they have tons of memory. They have tons of excess bandwidth capacity. That's their job. If they were bad at handling a lot of load, they'd be out of business. I mean, CDNs, that's how, the Super Bowl scales when they serve the Super Bowl over the internet or March Madness or whatever. Like, they scale it through CDNs.
Cool. That's all the questions so far in the chat. So I don't know if you want to carry on or.
Yeah. Like I said, anytime you're going to want to do a lot of traffic, this is precisely what you want. The only other thing I was going to do, Lee, was show you some of just writing some simple scripts just to see what that looks like.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so this right now I'm going to start with the Cloudflare workers interface, and I've got a little test domain that I use called memo, and so I have a test worker in my memo. So if you allow me to just drill into this demo worker here. And if we look at this, it just responds hello world. So let's look at that code. So I'm handling anything that comes in on this memo.com domain /demo with this. Actually, let me show you that real quick. Let me back up. Where did I define that? Yeah, here's my route. Anything at start.memo.com /demo is going to be routed to this worker. And then if I look at the code in this worker, it's very, very simple. I get my request that comes in, and then I respond with hello world. These console logs, I just put this in here so I can show you that in a second. But that's all it does. It just takes the request, and no matter what, it just is going to return 200 status with hello world. What is going on with me? I was trying to show you the console log here. Let me refresh that and try it again. There we go. So we can inspect the console, so you can see, like, we get the URL, we get, I don't know if I can drill in this, we get the headers. I would have to call the methods on it, but we could inspect the headers. We could, look at the user agent. We could, if there was like a JSON body, we keep the JSON body. Like, everything we need is in that request object. And then in the response object, obviously all the stuff you would expect. You have your, this is a readable stream, but it's hello world. We can manipulate our headers. We can do anything we want. So if we didn't want to just do a hello, so this might be, where this is where we do like our 403, like forbidden, right? we could run some logic here that, if authenticated, not authenticated. So I'm not going to be able to code this up live very well, but we could respond, right, with a 403. Otherwise, we could get the actual content. And the way that we get the content is where the fetch, both StackPath and Cloudflare use the fetch API. So we would just be able to fetch any site that we wanted. This is going to return a response. And so if I do this correctly, this should actually just return my MileSplit site. Let me save and deploy this. There's always a risk in doing this stuff live. Well, like what in the world? I requested demo memo and I got MileSplit, right? So what you're doing there is you're just going to fetch that website and then I'm returning it. But what we could do is we could grab that response and then we could do something with it. So for example, we could grab the body out of it. Oops. And so now we have a reference to that body, and then we could do manipulations on the body. We could do some sort of text replacement if we wanted to. We could add headers. A lot of times, what maybe we want to add the course headers so that we can do cross domain stuff automatically. We could with our live streams, we need to add a token, so we cache the video, the generic video, but then when we actually give it to the user, we manipulate the response to put the token into it. I mentioned earlier, all the other use cases that you can do, but essentially you can interpret the request. So the request dot. I don't think their autocomplete's working for me very well. The request should have the URL on it, but there's not autocompleting. But you can see here it does have the URL. But we could interpret that URL and we could do different things for different URLs. We could, we can add cookies on the fly. Maybe we need to add headers that go to the back end. Anything you can do, you can modify the request coming in, you can modify the response coming back. So I don't know, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but I can dive into that. But the cloud, I'll show you what StackPath's interface looks like. So if you go into your StackPath sites and pull up my test domain, StackPath has this, they just call it scripts over here on the left-hand side. And you can dive in there and you can set up these different scripts. And so very much the same way, you can see it's essentially the same exact format. And in fact, I've proven that 95% of my code is reusable from StackPath to Cloudflare, which is super nice because maybe at some point, like I am now, I want to be multi-CDN and actually be able to at least fail over between the two of them. So it's nice to be able to deploy the same code to two different CDNs.
How does something like this handle third-party code? So let's say you want to use some NPM package or something. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. You would not do it through this simple interface here. What you would do is, hopefully I'm not going to show you any proprietary code. I'm a little scared. But let's roll with it. So I have, this is something we do in our CDN. I don't want to go too far into the weeds here because I don't know what I'm going to show. But I think this file is going to be okay. So you can see I've written this in TypeScript and I'm importing all these third-party modules and I have like a router built in here that we're doing some manipulation, do some things we're doing before. We're adding the cores, if I mentioned earlier, adding course headers, doing my adding the tokens. These are all just helper methods I've done. This is my authentication. I'm enforcing the token. But the point is, to answer your question, yeah, I'm referencing all these third-party libraries, and to deploy this, I just do what I normally do. I do like TSC to build it, and then Cloudflare has a CLI called Wrangler, and then I just do Wrangler publish, and that CLI is automatically going to take everything from my dist folder, package it up into, essentially transpile it into, I think they actually put it into WebAssembly on the back end, I think. But they bundle it up and they upload it for me and deploy it for me. And I do that all from my command line here. I don't have to go into that console I just showed you. You could go in the console to get started, and it's great for experimenting, but this would be integrated either that you run manually at the command line to bundle it, or what we've done is this is part of our CI/CD pipeline. So I don't want to go too far down that, but if I just do a commit push to my GitHub, it's automatically, our CI/CD pipeline is automatically going to bundle it up and deploy it for me. So yeah, you can use all your libraries that you want.
Nice.
Now, keep it thin. With that said, you want to keep it thin. As I mentioned, you can do a lot of things, but doesn't always mean that you should. So yes, you should use third-party libraries, but I do think you should be cognizant of how many dependencies and how big that package is and how much you're trying to run, because you want to keep these scripts running quickly.
So is it kind of like regular Lambda, where the bigger the bundle, the slower it is to run it?
Yes. Now I haven't pushed the limits to say, how big is too big, but by default, I think Cloudflare gives you 128 megabytes of memory, right? So you don't want to get an application that's going to need a gig or 512 or whatever, because it's not going to perform well. And the name of the game with these edge side script is thinking about returning a response quickly to user, right? That's why, again, although you could, I don't recommend running your full application, which, even attempting to do so, unless you have a really thin application. If you're just doing strictly, Jamstack or something, maybe you could. I don't know.
Interesting. So I know you mentioned the pricing a little bit with Cloudflare was kind of like $5 a month flat rate.
Well, yeah, for maybe probably for most of the users, that they might be able to get away with that. Let's see if I can pull up the pricing real quick. Yeah, $5 a month is their minimum, and how many requests is that? Is that 50? I think it's 50 million.
Gives you the included there.
Okay, there we go. So no, this is KV. Sorry, KV is something else. I can tell you about KV, which is pretty awesome, but it's different. It's cheap. I think it's $5 a month for like 10 million, the first 10 million requests, and then 50 cents per million requests after that, something like that. And typically with Cloudflare, you also pay for CDN, which we get really good pricing because we have a lot of volume, but it's going to be affordable. Trust me. I mean, if you're not afraid of paying $10, $15, $20 a month, like, you can have all that you possibly need.
I imagine StackPath is similar.
Yep. Let's see if I can do a better job with StackPath finding Edge.
I believe Lambda at Edge is kind of the same pricing as like a regular Lambda.
Yeah, they're all pretty similar. So virtual machine, serverless scripting is what we're talking about here. 15 million requests per month, 60 cents per additional million requests, starting at $10 a month. So I think it's $10 a month for the 15 million requests, and then 60 cents per additional million.
You got an interesting question in the chat. It's asking if you've got like a static front end, I guess, that's cached, like a CSS file and HTML, but the HTML links to a separate CDN for like Bootstrap or something. He says, will it rip a hole in space-time?
No, it won't. You can absolutely use the CDNs together. There's no problem with that. I mean, anything you can do within your application, you can do here. I'm actually working on an application right now. I don't know if you guys know how HLS works, and I won't get into the details of how HLS works, but basically with HLS, you have manifests, which are text files, and you have the actual video files. I'm going to roll out soon something, and I won't get into the details of why, is going to be serving the manifest from Cloudflare and the video chunks from CloudFront, those are confusing, Cloudflare and CloudFront. So I'm going to, for the same video stream, I'm going to be serving half the manifest from one and the videos from the other. Do what you need to do.
Cool. Is there a, I guess, good starting maybe project idea for using Edge scripts or something like that? Anything that you think would be maybe something you could do in the CLI, or not the CLI, the like the editor that comes built into some of these things?
So StackPath has a pretty good blog, and part of the blog, they often come out with some different ideas and things they built. Like I don't know, maybe a year ago, they had one where they did the JWT authentication. And Cloudflare has something similar, but they have a bunch of examples and recipes of sample code. I should have had these ready for you. This template gallery. So here's this template gallery is maybe a good place to start. And they have any of these. They have different snippets of different code you can use, and these are a great place to get ideas, because you can be like, oh, I could do something similar to that for my use case.
Cool.
And they're easy to set up. I mean, you saw, like, you could set up an account, and I think that I don't know if there's any free ones. I was trying to think if there's any free ones you can use without even paying. There might be some free tier on some of these, but you can see, like, you can just get in here and start coding and saying, well, what if I do this, and how does this respond? And, you can fetch Google. Like I just fetched MileSplit and then replaced every mention of Google with your name or something. Like, you can just start playing with it and getting some ideas, and I think that you'll quickly find use cases. I get excited about it because all of a sudden we go from having this dumb CDN to a very smart CDN, and our imagination runs wild. Like, we could do this, we could do that. I will mention KV real quick. I ran into KV on accident a few seconds ago. So KV stands for key value, and Cloudflare has a companion product to Workers called Workers KV, which is a very fast data store at the edge. So typically you can't persist data in these edge scripts, but with KV you can actually persist. Essentially, it's like Redis. You can persist some key value stores that are very fast reads. So while it may be slow-ish to go back to your backend database and not recommended, it would be uber fast if you had jammed stuff into KV and we're pulling stuff out of KV. So there are some persistence capabilities as well.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, because typically you would have, like, the CDN out front, and then in your cloud stack you might have like a server and a database, and then, like, your key value store like Redis or something, all kind of in that area, and then responding back through the CDN, where with KV, that's way up front, closer to the user. So I can only imagine that would be like a huge speed increase.
Yeah, for sure. The limitation right now of KV, they advertise it as fast reads and slow writes. So if you need something because they propagate it across all their network, and so it sometimes takes a little while to propagate. So, like, if you write something to KV, it might take 15, 20, 30 seconds for it to propagate. So if it needs to be super real time, KV is not a great option. But on the other flip side of that, it's super fast for reads. So they promise that, like, I don't even know the latencies, but it's super low latency, and it's stored right there, essentially physically beside your edge script. So it's going to be on the same network. It's going to be Lightning.
Nice.
So we're going to do stuff like that in the future with our like pushing out our geo rules. I mentioned we have sometimes geo rules for our scripts, where our streams rather, where you can only watch it if you're from the United States. Where we can push into KV all of the rules for a given stream. So then when a user comes in to request to watch a certain stream, we know right away, like, oh, no, you're from Canada. You can't watch this because we just checked our KV and, Canada's not allowed. So there's a lot of use cases like that.
Awesome. Looking at the their little UI here, it looks like they're using like Chrome's console. Like they pulled out a portion of the Chrome DevTools. That's pretty neat.
Yeah, so both StackPath and Cloudflare implement the service workers API and the fetch API, which are implemented in the browser as well. So they somehow hacked away, because it's the same thing, where they could do it right in the browser. I don't know the magic they did, but so it uses the same APIs that you can actually use in the browser. So somehow I think they hooked those two concepts together.
Awesome.
But this is a great debugging tool, because that's sometimes a problem, is that you get a response and you don't know why, or you get back a 500 because you made some script error and you don't know why. It's really great to be able to jump in this console and just start playing around and do console log like I was, just to say, well, what is this coming back as?
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I don't see any other questions in the chat. Are you ready to wrap up, or do you have anything else to show off?
No, I'm good. I'm happy to, if you guys have any questions later, feel free to, tweet me or hit me on Slack, and, we can chat more about it. Obviously, this is a technology I'm super passionate about. I'm excited. I think that this is the way of the future in a lot of ways. I think a lot of us will be using this down the line, as well as WebAssembly, but that's a different meetup. I think the CDNs agree with me. I mean, that's why Fastly is trying to rush to market to come out with their own solution. They see the writing on the wall. Fastly, by the way, is going to come out with it probably next, I don't know, they haven't told me that when they're coming out of beta, but let's say later this year or beginning of next year. Initially, Fastly is only going to support Rust for their, they call their product Compute at Edge. So Rust is an interesting language that maybe some of you might want to think about learning as well. Rust is super fast and low level in the operating system. It gets actually compiled. So anyway, but they're going to support that out of the gate because they're so obsessed with performance. I mentioned to you that CDNs want to turn around very quickly. They don't want to spend have a lot of like CPU cycles sitting around processing this stuff. They want the request to respond quickly, and they don't want anything get in the way of it. And that's why Fastly is insisting on Rust, because they want to make sure it's fast in WebAssembly, compiling WebAssembly. But anyway, all that to say, like, the CDN companies know it's coming, and that's why they're all pouring so many resources into it. So hopefully you guys are excited to also start experimenting.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for giving the presentation, Jason. It was awesome.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining.
Bye.